Hi guys, I'm Bobsy, and in this video we're going to be looking into how to making a proper multiplayer player inventory. Now, I already tried doing this in my survival series where I kind of just did it on the fly, didn't prepare anything. And to be honest with you, I'm not too happy with how it turned out. So this is my real attempt at making a proper inventory that's easy to sync, easy to send data over the network, and most importantly, easy to maintain and scale. So first of all, let me just show you what the end product is going to end up like, because this is not going to be a quick and easy dirty setup. This is going to be a proper setup. It's going to take a little bit of time. I'm going to try and explain it as well as possible. And I'm not going to be sharing any of the code because I'd rather have you guys understand what we're actually doing so you can, tweak it and apply it to your project rather than just try and copy my code and then not have it work, and I'll have you in our Discord in a second. But please do remember to join the Discord though, people are very active in there, and there was actually a community member named Soul that got me interested in trying to making a proper inventory. So first of all, let me just try and show you. On our left here, we have the local inventory. So if I click here, you can see I've now picked up these items, and you can see if I right click again, I'll drop the items, it'll just pick a random position, and you can see that's synced over here as well. Now the right side here, we have our clone, and on the left side, we have our host. So you can see the host can also pick up some items, and that works just fine. Now, more interestingly, we also have a shared inventory, and you can see if I now left click on the items here, it'll pop it into the shared inventory where everybody has access to them. Everybody can pick them up. And you can see here, everybody can add to it. This guy can take it out again. This guy over here can take stuff out again. And yeah, it really just works. It's a full coherent inventory with both a shared system and a player inventory. Now, of course, this is quite limited because there's only really these two, but the whole point of the system is it should be really easy for you to scale in the future. There's a few quick and dirty things I do in here, which you would have to obviously modify yourself to have it work how you want in your system. For example, such as obviously the shared inventory shouldn't be available or open at all times. That should probably be like a chest you click on or something like that. But in my case, I think it was just nice, easy, dirty, and simple to just, show it like this. But essentially, the system is very easily scalable, and let me show you how. So there's only a few things that this setup really needs. It needs obviously some kind of items, which is what's in the world here, and you can see they have the item script on them. Now they also have a reference to the preset, and the preset is essentially where all the magic happens, because the preset, we're baking in a unique ID, which we can use to send over the network and serialize and everything like that. I'll show you how that works. It's not as scary as it sounds, and luckily serializing in PurrNet is actually rather easy. Now we also have a direct reference back to the prefab again. This is what we use to spawn it from the inventory back into the world, and then obviously the icon that we want to show. And you also notice there's also stacks and stuff like that. So let me start by just going over really quickly how my UI is set up, because I'm not going to be setting up the UI again. First of all, both of these are set up exactly the same. Just looking away from scripts, but just looking at the pure setup, I just have a background, I have the tiles. Don't mind the scripts again, we'll be making those again. And all they have is just a background, some kind of icon, which is sort of overlaid on top right now, just a white box. And this is what we change out. And then some kind of quantity number. It's essentially just these. I've just laid them out by hand. There's no layout groups, no UI, fancy shenanigans, anything like that. And I just gave them a title just so we could easily identify what is what. Now, let me clear out the scene and let me essentially make a new setup. So that way, you guys can follow from scratch. Now, there's absolutely no functionality as far as I'm aware in my scene. I've removed everything that's not just the basic networking setup. Obviously, I still do have just the PurrNet networking setup with just a player spawner. And of course, actually, let me just make a new player as well, tutorial player, and just remove the scripts off of him again, so you guys can follow along when we remake the scripts. So let me just plop the tutorial player in here, and there we go. So now when we're in the scene, I start up the scene that is no functionality. As you can see, this doesn't serialize properly. The shared inventory is gone. The tutorial player is here and he's completely empty. And that's essentially all that we have. Now I've set up all my scripts in just this old folder, so now we can go and create our scripts once again. Right, so one of the first things that we need is the item definitions, right? So we need, first of all, just to define what is an item. And other than this definition as well, one other thing that we also need is we need the item preset, as I mentioned. You can call it what you want. You can call it an item reference or whatever. And the item you can call an item instance, whatever you want. I'm just gonna stick to my naming here. So first of all, the item preset is a scriptable object. This is essentially how we move it around the place. And here, what we want is, first of all, we want a reference to, actually, let's give it a name. So let's give it the item name. Let's give it a reference to the actual item, which I'm gonna call the prefab. And then we're gonna do a serialized field sprite to the icon as well, just so we have everything that we need here. And then if we go into the item, what we essentially want here is we want a reference to the preset. So I'm going to do a private item preset and give it a reference to the preset. And then we can also just make that publicly accessible easily by just doing this for referencing, referencing preset like so, and just name this one properly. There we go. Okay, so now we have a public reference to our preset, and here we set our preset. This is just to avoid us falsely setting it for some reason. It's essentially just a little C# safety. So if you're familiar with C#, you'd be familiar with this too. All right, cool. And going back into the item preset, actually, yeah, let's continue from here. So one of the things that we want to do now is set up our inventory. So going back into Unity, let's now just make a script and call that inventory. And we'll get a little bit more fancy with this later, but for now, let's just stick to what it is. So opening up the inventory, and first of all, I completely forgot, but the inventory has to be network behavior, and so does the item, of course, because, you know, it's our item, it has to act on the network for so on and so forth. We need to be able to spawn it and whatnot. Also, I completely forgot with the item preset, of course, that is that's a scriptable object, so therefore we, of course, need a context menu. So for this, let's just do a context menu with the file name. Whoops. Oh, sorry, not a context menu, I'm silly. A create asset menu. And this with the file name, and we'll just give it whatever file name. This can just be item preset. And then we give it the menu name, and this can be something like scriptable object / item preset or whatnot. Right, okay, so with this established, now let's get back into our inventories. Now we can actually create the item presets and whatnot. And now going back into the inventory script here, one of the first things that we want is we want a custom struct, which is essentially what we're going to do to or utilize to store our current state of our inventory slot. Right, so we're just going to call this an inventory item. The reason why it's an inventory item now is because it's essentially the representation of an item, but in the inventory. And where it acts as a representation is because it holds a reference to the preset again. And again, this is the magical preset that we're sending around. And of course, it also holds an int for the quantity that we're currently holding of this item. This is what essentially makes it stackable. All right, cool. Now, one of the things, and you'll very quickly notice this if you're a little bit familiar with networking, is now we want to, I guess let's actually not serialize it. Actually, let's serialize it. We want to make a sync array of our inventory items. And we'll call this inventory item, for example, something like this. And this will just be a new sync array. But if you have a keen eye and if you're familiar with networking, you'll now notice we're trying to network a scriptable object. And this is by nature not working. And this won't work. And this is where a little bit of magic comes in. And let me also try and just quickly find the documentation for you here. So right here we have the networking of custom types. There's a bunch of ways to handle networking of custom types, but the most efficient one is essentially creating a static custom type. And that's essentially what we're going to be doing right now. Now it's a little bit more advanced because we need some way of essentially cross-referencing scriptable objects. And scriptable objects by nature, you can't really just cross-reference easily. But one of the ways that you can do it is if we make an ID for it. So what I'd like to do is I'll make a per read only. This essentially just means it's a field that'll be read only, so we can see that everything has worked correctly. And I'll call this the UID. And now in here, we'll do an if Unity editor. This essentially means anything inside here will just remain in the Unity editor. It'll essentially be stripped when you build it. And that's completely fine because again, we just want it baked in here, which means it has to stay in here, both in editor and in build. And again, this doesn't get stripped, only what's in here. And here we'll have an onValidate. onValidate will essentially run every time an update has happened and you've clicked on the object or whatever in order to update it visually. And here we actually want to get the path. We essentially just want to get something that's unique. You could just do a random.range and then give it a huge number. The likelihood of 2 being the same is extremely low. But what we essentially want to do is we want to do Unity editor.assetDatabase.getAssetPath to this. So we'll essentially just get the path, which will be unique every time. So again, where I mentioned you could just do like a random number, we're essentially just going to do the path because we know that's unique for certain. Now, a good little safety check to have is just check if the asset path comes out as null. In case it does, we'll just set the UID back to an empty string. That way we can see it in editor and we'll just return. Otherwise, with this, we'll have to get the asset UID, and this is essentially the UID, which is fully unique, and that's actually exactly what it's trying to do here. It gets the UID from the asset path that we've now found, and this way we can just store the UID. Now, a good little safety, again, Copilot is really helping me out here. But a good little safety is just to check whether it's null or empty. And to check that it's of course not the same as just the, the existing one, because we don't want to set it again. So now that we have this, we should have a UID setup, and now we can actually go and immediately just test this. So going out here to test, let's go down to our resources, and I'll just make a new folder and just call these pre-made just so we don't confuse them. Just plop these in here. And let me go and make some new ones, right? So let me go scriptable object, item preset, and what will this item be? I'm not sure. Let's just call it this for now. And let's just give it some tile. Let's see if we find a tile that's good. And you can actually see it already generated the UID back here. Let me just find, let's take this tile, for example, and let's just call it wood. We can give it the item name of wood. In this case, the name doesn't matter. I don't actually use it for anything, but you could. And now I guess let's just go and make, so this tile 0011, let's just go and make the object. So 2D object, sprites, I'm just going to make a square in my case. And this is just going to be wood. And this is going to be tile 0011. And let's put this into 0000 in the world. So it's back here, and I think I scaled them up a little bit just to make them fit a little better. Yep, here we go. So that's my wood. I now have this here, and I should be able to also just plop the item script onto that, so now we can cross-reference them. So the item script gets the preset, and the preset, if we open that, should get the item script. Of course, we need to make this into a prefab first. Let me also just make a folder for these. So this will be the where the rubber and the shields, they were my old items. And I'll just make an item out of the wood. And now the wood prefab, the preset in here will need the wood prefab, and there we go. So now they're essentially cross-referenced, linked back and forth. All right, great. Let's go back into our script. We're not exactly done. Actually, we need some more scripts now. We need that database that I mentioned. So let's go and make that first. Let's go and make our item database. Now, this can just stay mono behavior. This doesn't have to be networked because it's essentially just your local computer that needs to get an overview over all the items. Right, so one of the ways that we can do this is we can make a private dictionary that can be string to item preset. And this, obviously our string being the UID, the item preset being, well, the item preset. And we can just store all items presets like this. Cool, now in Awake, we can just pull all the presets. And let's also just register it as an instance while we're here, because we will be needing this later. So I'll be registering it as an instance, and then in onDestroy, I'll of course be unregistering again. There we go. So now we have the reference, and now let's register the database. So what I'll do is I'll get all the presets, which we'll get from resources.load all. And actually, this is something I completely forgot to mention. That's my mistake. We will load the item preset. This is something I completely forgot to mention. You might not have noticed, but I made the item preset in the resources folder. This is actually very, very important. Oh, and of course the path just needs to be nothing here. But this is actually very important that that is in the resource folder. The reason for this is because Unity only allows loading dynamically for builds in the resource folder. If it wasn't a build, we could do essentially what we're already doing here. So at the item preset, we're doing the Unity editor, asset database. This allows you to get any asset in the entire game. The thing is, this is under the Unity editor class, which is only accessible while you're in the Unity editor. This is not accessible in builds. The only thing that is accessible in builds is the resources. And the resources has to be in the resources folder. I hope that makes sense. That's just a bit of nature, so Unity doesn't have to keep all of this in memory. It's essentially an efficiency thing. This way it only has to keep the resources folder accessible at runtime. Okay, cool. With that out the way, and hopefully you learned a little bit from that, let's go into the for each loop, and let's for each through each of our presets. I'll just call this a preset. And essentially what we want to do is we'll do if is not item presets.try add, and here we'll essentially try add our preset.uid, and we'll add our preset, and if it does not manage to add the preset, we'll debug log out an error, and we can say something like duplicates item preset uid found with the preset.uid, something like that. That should be completely fine. And the last thing that we need to do in the item database now is we need to make it accessible that we can actually get the item. So let's just make a public bool, try get item preset. We want to feed it the UID, and we want to get the item preset, like so. If you're not familiar with this, this is quite simple. Essentially the bool here, we will return whatever we want. We can always return true if we wanted to, or we could always return false. Essentially this is just like any other bool. The difference is we're doing something with out here, right? And out essentially means that we'll be able to feed back whatever that we find, in this case, our item preset. So the way that we do this is, first of all, I just want to check if string is null or empty, if for the UID. Just in case, it's just a little safety feature. If it is, we set the item to null and we return false, essentially meaning we did not find an item, or sorry, the preset. And otherwise we can return the item presets dot try get value for the UID out to the preset. What this essentially means is the try get value return true if we get something, false if we don't, which means now this whole method will return true if we get something, false if we don't, and it'll be outed to this. Right. Okay, cool. So that out the way, now we can get into, I would say, the last sort of quite advanced thing here, which is making the actual serializer. So going back into scripts, we can essentially call this whatever you really want. It doesn't matter much. It's not going to exist in the scene. I'm going to call it like inventory data utils or whatever, just some utility class that we can use. And more importantly, we want to make this into a static class immediately. So as you can see now, this is a static class, and now we need to make a writer and a reader. Now, let me just firstly clarify what a writer and a reader is. And going back to custom writer and reader stuff here. Essentially what it is it's instructions for how the network should read or write a type. So writing obviously means how do we write this? In this case, you can see the example that we have here is we're writing a vector2, which means we need to write both the x and the y value individually. And then when we unpack it, we want to read the y value and the x value individually again. And the important thing about this is it needs to be in order. So when we write something, it needs to be in the same order. So let's say I write X, I write Y, I write C. I have to also read X, Y, and C. If I were to try and read X, C, and Y, they would be switched, if that makes sense. So it essentially expects you to read the data in the correct order. Now, knowing this, let's make a public static void, and this will just be our item preset writer. And this will take in a bit packer for a packer, and it'll take in an item preset for the actual item that we want to, or the preset, or whatever you want to call it. Let me keep consistent here, let me call it preset, for the actual preset. So first of all, let's just check if the preset is null. If that is null, one thing that we actually want is we want to write in whether we actually have an object or not. This is for the reading part, and it'll make sense in a little bit. So the way that we do that is we do packer, bool, and then we can do .write. And then in this case, we have to feed our packer and then feed whatever value. In this case, false, because we don't have an object. And then I'll just return, because we don't need to write any more data because we don't have an object. Now, following, let's essentially do the same thing, but this time write true, because now we know we have an object. And then now we also write what we want to write, and this is where the UID comes in. We essentially want to write our UID. So I write it to the packer, and I do it with the preset.uid. And there we go. And that's essentially it. Now we're custom writing to the network, essentially an item preset. It's that easy. Now the reading part is a little more tricky because this is why we essentially have to get it, but that's why our item database comes in handy. Just following the logic very quickly, and I know this is a lot of talking, but I want you to understand it properly. Essentially now that it comes to actually reading it, what we will be doing is we'll be reading and checking, do we have an object first of all? If it's true, then great, we have an object. And then we can move on and we can read the UID. And with that UID, we can then reference the item database, which is why we made it an instance. We then reference the item database, we try and see if we can get the preset, and then we can safely return that preset. So let's move on with that. So let's do public static void, item preset reader. This also takes in the bit packer for the packer. And now we have to out a reference to the item preset that we'll just call preset again. And don't mind the reference, you don't really have to think about it in this case, and I don't want to explain it right now. If you want to learn it, it's easily Googleable. I don't know if that's a phrase, searchable online. and yeah, it's essentially just a C# thing. So first of all, let's check if we have an item. So let's do a hash preset, false, and here we'll do packer of type bool, .read, we'll read from the packer, and we want to read a reference to our hash preset. So now it essentially has output to here whether we have a preset or not. So now we can say if we do not have a preset, we want to set our preset to null, and we just have to return again, because if we don't have an item, similar to up here, if we don't have an item, we don't want to write anymore. Same here, if we don't have an item, we don't need to read anymore. We just need to return. So now we can check if we can get the instance. So let's do the instance handler.try_get_instance out of the item database. And we can just call that database. If we do not have an item database, I would probably want to log an error. Fail to get items database instance, something like that, for reading item preset, something like that. That should be plenty, just so you have some information. We really shouldn't hit that case, but just in case. Now, similar thing, we want to read a UID, and this should just be a default value of the type string. And now we access our packer. We want to read a string. We do .read, we read from the packer, and we read out to the UID. So same thing really. And now what we can just do is we can do database.try_get_item_preset. We feed it the UID and we out to the preset that we have up here. And there we go. It's as easy as that. So now we try to get the preset. We should get the preset, and now we should be able to network safely this. So going back into the inventory now this whole inventory item struct can safely be networked as we'd want. So now let's head back into the inventory where we now have this sync array. And let's just think a little bit on what we want to be able to do, right? Because let's take it one step at a time. So let's do a public bool that we'll call try add item. And this will take in an item preset for the preset to add. And we can also add a certain quantity, just so you guys have it for later. I don't think we'll be using it, but you know, it's always nice to have. And then I think something we should try and have is we should do a try stack. So we'll do a bool try stack. This will essentially just check, does it already exist? In case it does, then just add it to the existing stack. I can't spell quantity for the life of me. And if it doesn't have a stack, let's also have a private bool of try add new item for the item preset int quantity. There we go, I spelled it right. And there we go. Cool. So what we can do up here now is we can do if we try stack the item, try stack. And we feed it the preset and the quantity, which means if that succeeds, we'll return true. And if it doesn't succeed, we'll essentially return the result of try add new item. And here we'll of course feed the preset and the quantity. There we go. I hope this makes sense. So now it'll essentially go through, try and add it to existing stacks. If it can't add it to existing stacks, then it'll create a new item. And if it fails to create a new item, then it'll have failed to try and add the item total. Cool. This is not too uncommon code, but of course I understand if it can be a little confusing. Now let's start by just essentially looping through, not for each, I want a for loop. Let's start by looping through our inventory items, length. And let's just store our inventory item, just makes it easy. Inventory items at position I, right? So now we're looping through essentially all of the inventory items, and we want to check if the presets are the same. So yeah, essentially what it wants to do here, if the presets are not the same, we just continue to the next loop and check again. And if they are the same, we'll take the inventory item, item.quantity, we'll add the quantity that we want to add on top. And then we'll essentially just store it back. So I'll do that equals to inventory item. So we're just storing it back and then we're returning true. And if we get all the way down here, that means that we fail to find any match and we will return false. It should really be that easy and that simple. Now moving on to the try add item, let's do the same thing. So let's make a for loop and let's loop through each of the inventory items .length. And here essentially we'll just check if any inventory item even exists. So let's first of all start by just similar thing again, just getting the inventory item, and then we'll just check if inventory item.preset does not equal to null, or I guess just basically exists like that, not return, sorry, we want to continue. And then once again, if we get down here, I just want to return false. And if we're on the end in here, I just want to return true. So now we can add whatever functionality that we need in here. And in this case, it will be the inventory item.preset should be equals to the preset. The inventory item.quantity should be equal to the quantity. And then we just need to set the inventory item again to the inventory item. Now, in case you're confused, by the way, of why we're doing this, this is because we're working with structs, which means they don't work exactly as classes. With classes, when you just do this, it would save it directly into the same class. But the thing is, structs, they essentially make a copy. So every time that we do this, this is now a copy. This is not actually the entry that's in here, it's a copy of that entry. And you might think that's heavier, like by nature. I remember I originally thought that was slower, but actually it's not slower, it's actually faster, because when you sort of have to make a reference to something all the time, that essentially has to be stored in memory, which, you know, causes more RAM usage. So actually it's heavier to sort of constantly keep a class around than it is moving structs around. All right, cool. Just that out the way, little extra learning again. This should be okay now. We can get into the rest of the functionality later, but now at least we can add items and we can pick items up. So now let's get into actually displaying the items. For this, I want to make a new class. And this class should be our inventory view. That's essentially what I'll just call like the whatever renders the actual inventory. So let's make an inventory view. And once again, this can just stay mono behavior. Nothing needs to be networked in here. This just has to handle the visuals and nothing else. So the first thing, let me think. The first thing is we probably, yeah, actually we want to make the script for the tiles as well. So let me go and make that. So going out here, I'll make an inventory tile. And quickly, let's just check what the inventory tile should hold. So let's do a serialized field, private image, and this is the icon image. It should also have a serialized field for the tmp_text. This of course needs to be UI. And this is the quantity text. And then it also needs to keep a reference to what index that it has, just so we can always cross-reference the index. And it also needs to be initialized with what inventory view it belongs to. So this should first of all be able to be initialized quite easily. So let's make a public void init. That will just be our initialization. This will be fed an inventory view, which will be our inventory view. And it should also be fed what index that it is. And we should be able to just store these pretty easily, like so. There it goes. Now we're storing these references. Now we also need some code for, I guess let's start by resetting the tile. So let's make a private void reset tile. And I think this should essentially just make the icon.color equals to clear so that you can't see it. Let's just set the sprite to null as well, and let's set the quantity text to nothing. And then let's call this an awake just so that we can see that they actually initialize properly. And then let's also make a public void set item, and then let's just feed it the full inventory item, because that already holds all the information we need. You know, it holds quantity and it holds the item preset. And then let's go ahead and first of all just check if the inventory item, if the inventory item that preset does not exist, then I think we just want to reset the tile and we want to return. That essentially just means that there is nothing in the slot. And if there is something in the slot, we want to set the quantity text, we want to set the sprite, and we want to set the icon. And of course, for some odd reason, I decided to make them all serialized fields that are private instead of just making it public. I probably should. So, okay, I hope that makes sense. And there we go. So now we're setting the color back to white, which essentially just means full color. We're setting the icon, and we're setting the quantity text. Okay, cool. Now we need to call these from our inventory view. So going back to our inventory view now, let's make this, as I originally wanted to make, a serialized field, private inventory tile. And this, oh, sorry, not inventory tile, this will be an inventory tile array. And this will just be of all the tiles. Cool, and let's also have this one actually keep a check on which instance it belongs to. Just in our case, you can do this differently. You don't have to. This is one of the places where I think you probably should deviate a bit. Because, you know, every stash might have various inventories and so on, so you might want to do it differently. Or I guess you could also just reinitialize the inventory view when you click on a chest. I think that's completely valid as well. But, so I guess since we need this, let's also make a public void, and let's call that init here, and that'll take in the inventory, like so. And then we can just store the reference to the inventory that it belongs to, at least at the current moment. And that should essentially be all that we need here. And I guess we could... let me think. No, let's do it in awake. So in awake, I want a for loop through each of the inventory tiles. And actually, let me just name this properly with an underscore just so I stay consistent. And this will be the inventory tiles.length. And the reason why I want to do it in a for loop and not for each is because we need the index. So let's do inventory tiles at position I, but initialize to this and the index. And that should essentially be it. That was the initialization that we made earlier. So now it should initialize all of them correctly. Okay, cool. Now, the next thing that we want is we wanted to actually draw the thing. Now, I'm going to take the lazy approach. This is, again, a place you can definitely optimize. I'm just going to redraw the entire inventory every time something changes because it's the least amount of code right now and it should still get the idea across. So let's just call it like redraw everything. We'll take in a full inventory item array. And this should essentially redraw the whole thing. So what we want to do first is we want to for each through our inventory tiles. And then let me just store the item. So let's just store this in item again. And then let me first of all just check that there hasn't come in more more data than we have inventory tiles. Obviously that wouldn't be good. It shouldn't be the case. But just in case that the length is less than or equals to I. Then we want to debug.log error, send more items than tiles. And then let's just store the I is greater than the inventory tiles dot length. And let's also just throw a reference to this and then let's return. This is really just for safety. It shouldn't happen as long as our setup is good, but you can never be too safe. And now let's just grab the tile, call set item, and that should essentially do it. Cool. So now let's try and head back to our inventory. And one of the things that we actually want with our inventory is we want it to be abstract. The reason why I want it to be abstract is because we have two different types of inventories right now, and you might have even more. So it really just allows for a lot more scalability, the fact that we make it abstract. But first, let's just focus on the player inventory. So I'll make a new script for this called player inventory. And now we'll have this inherit from inventory. And this player inventory now needs some kind of inventory view. The thing is we can't just serialize it because obviously this player inventory is spawned with the player because we want it to be owner auth and all that. So let's try and think a little bit here. So I guess first of all, we know that we want the reference. So let's get a private inventory view and this will be the inventory view. And let's just make the functionality and let's think about how we get the view a little bit after. So in the unspawned, I just want to do if we're not the owner, we just return, just for good measure. And then let's do an instance handler.register instance and let's register this. Now we only register it if we are the owner, keep that in mind. So that means that now in the instance handler, the player inventory will be the local instance. And this is actually really, really useful. So now let's also on despawn, make sure to check if we are not the owner, we just return. And then we'll do instance handler.onRegister instance, the player inventory. Cool. Now another thing that we also want to do, and this is where the actual updating comes in, is we want to grab the inventory items, which we have in the inventory, which I of course made private. Let's make that protected. Protected essentially is a bit the same as private, except we can also get it through our inheritance. So now let's up here, get the inventory items, and let's do unchanged. Let's do on inventory changed, something like that. And let's also just unregister from that down here, just for good measure. And let's have the ID auto fill that out. And that should look something like this. And now if the inventory view is not null, we want the inventory view.redraw everything to the inventory items to array, because obviously it's expecting a clean array, not a sync array. So that's really the way that we do this here. Cool. So now whenever items are actually added, it should theoretically work. And I think at this point we should already be able to technically get a test going. So let's actually try that. So let me do a serialized field, private item preset. Let's just call it test item. And let's try and do a context menu. And we call that add test item. I'll just do a private void add test item. We'll remove this in a little bit again. I just want to check that this actually works. So let's just from in here call the try add item. And let's add the test item. And let's just add one of those. So now let's go and try and set everything up as well. We haven't even really set anything up yet. So first of all, we set up the test player, which I had in here, the tutorial player. Let's set that up with the player inventory, like so. And let's just set it up with a test item, which is our wood for now. And also the inventory items, this needs to be owner auth, and also it should be the length of the amount of inventory slots that we have. In our case, we have 12. Right, so I'm just gonna set it to 12. Okay, cool. Also now on the inventory view, let's call this one inventory view. Oh, and I completely forgot. First of all, I guess let's set up all the inventory tiles. So we have all the tiles here. You can see I removed all the scripts on them. Let me actually just make them not a prefab. And then let's add the inventory tile. To this, let's feed it the icon. Let's feed it the text. And then let me also put this tile into pre-made. Let me make a new tile here. And then let me make all of these replace into this tile here. Right, so now this should all be set up as tiles. I can go into the inventory view, just lock this, feed it all the tiles. Don't know why Unity Editor keeps screaming at me with this, but let's just leave that be. And there we go. So now the inventory is set up with all the tiles. Now, one thing that I completely forgot now is we still don't have a way for our inventory, for the player inventory, for example, to actually get the correct inventory view. Now, I have a lazy way of going about this, and I'm just gonna do this for now. I'm gonna, in the inventory view, now please do not follow my lead on this, because you have better ways to do it, right? The way you would normally get the inventory view is likely you would, predefine it, you'd set up some instant handle or something like that. I'm just gonna go lazy, and I'm just gonna call it view name here, and then I'm just gonna create an instance system just based on this very quickly, just because that's a very lazy but easy way to go about it. So let me make a dictionary string to inventory view. I'll just call this instances equals to new, and then in awake I'll just have the instances dot, or actually just the view name set to this, and then on destroy obviously I'll do instances dot remove, and I'll just remove the view name again. Again, this is really bad behavior, but it's just a very easy way for me to do it. And again, I don't need very advanced stuff in my setup here. This is not the cleanest, but you get the idea. You've worked with instances before, and since you're working with networking, I very much imagine you can do this as well. So now let me set the inventory view equals to inventory view dot instances, and this should be at the. Let's also just have the view name here, private string view underscore view name. And we'll get the view name from here. Again, this will error and fail and everything if you do not set the view names up correctly. But again, my case here is rather simple. So let's try and do it like this. The view name here, I'll just call player inventory, and I'll just make sure to copy paste that, go into the tutorial player, and also feed it in here. Okay, cool. So now let's start it up. We have the player index out of range, sync array. What did I do? Alright, so here we are, and I'm going to try and add the test item. And as you can see, here we actually got it, but you can see it says failed to get item database, which means it actually failed to send it. And that's because we forgot to add the item database in the scene. I'm just going to add the item database here. Just going to add the item database there, and there we go. Now we shouldn't get this error anymore. I'll try and add test item. You can see now we've added 1, added 2, added 3, and as you can see, they stack perfectly fine. Cool. So now adding stuff in here actually works as intended. That's great. Now let's keep moving. Now with this, we can remove the testing setup here again. I don't think we'll be needing it. Now let's add the actual adding items by clicking on things, right? So what I want to do is I want to add a new script. And of course you can add items however you want to add items. So I'm just going to add it in 2D really quickly. So I'm just going to call this one player clicker. And then this is of course going to be a network behavior. And I'm just going to give it a reference to its actual inventory, because that's going to be on the player anyway, or that is on the player anyway. I'm just going to say if we are not the owner, we just return here. And then I'm going to do if we do not have the input of the mouse down. Oh, I see I messed that up. There, key code dot mouse 0. Then we just return. God damn. And here we'll just make our raycast. So yeah, pretty much as it wants to do here. I'm just gonna raycast. We check if the collider we hit is null, And if it's not null, we check if the item exists. We check if we can add the item. We check if we successfully add the item. And if we do successfully add the item, we'll destroy the item that we clicked on. So that will be the item.gameObject. So here we go. That should pretty much work. And also instead of equals to null, can just do that. Yeah, and so adding this to the player real quick. We go here, tutorial player. Let's do player clicker. Drag and drop the inventory in there. And then in here, and now I'm going to click on this item, which does not have a collider, obviously. Let's do box collider 2D. There we go. Try it again. Now when I click it, you can see it gets destroyed from here and it gets added in the inventory. Great. So now I have a quick and dirty, easy way to add things to my inventory. Now with that out the way, let's make our inventory tile a little bit more advanced as well, so we can actually start doing things with it. But for that, we need to also figure out what are all the things that we want to do. And as I see it, we pretty much want 2 interactions. I want sort of, I guess, a general interact and a right click as well. I'm just going to call it something like interact and drop, I think. So let's start by adding these. Let me scroll down, I guess, and let me do a public virtual void interact. And we want to know which index interacted with. And also make a public virtual void drop item. We want to know what index interacted and I guess how many to drop. Cool. All right, in my case, first of all, the first thing that we can actually just check is we can check if the index is less than 0 or if the index is greater than or equals to the inventory items.count. Again, this is a case that generally shouldn't happen, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. Safeguard it also so you guys can have an easier time debugging. So I'm just going to say this was an invalid index for inventory item, something like that. And then I'll just return. Cool. Here, let's get the actual inventory item. And then let's check if the inventory item.preset is null. And if it is null, we'll of course return again, because that means we have nothing to drop. Now, if we do have something to drop, the first thing that we want to do is we want to calculate the amount to drop. So this will be the mathf.minimum. And the reason why it's minimum, and I'll go over this with you in just a second. The reason why it's minimum is because we want to find the smallest amount, right? So in case that, for example, we only want to drop 2, but we have 5, well, in that case, we only want to actually drop 2. But let's say we want to drop 10, and we only have 5. We only want to drop 5 because, well, that's how many we have. I hope that makes sense. And then let's also just quickly make a, I guess I'll just make it a private void. Let's call it spawn item. And we can just feed it the actual item prefab at this point. And let's just easily instantiate the item. And let's just do it at some random position. In my case, I'm just going to do random.inside unit circle. Just going to do ×3, and then I'm just going to give it quaternion identity. Cool. This now means that now I can choose to spawn it this amount of times. So we can call spawn item, and then we get inventory item.preset.prefab, like that. And I don't even need these. Here we go. And lastly, we of course need a way to remove items. Checked it, virtual void remove item. And there's a reason for why I'm doing this. This is because also when we want to move items between inventories, we want to remove them, but without spawning them. This is why we need a method specifically for this. So item preset, I'm just going to call this preset. Or actually, I think we want to remove an item at an index. So let's feed it the index, and let's feed it the amount that we want to remove. And let's first of all, just in here again, get the inventory item. So we're going to do inventory items at index. And then we'll just do inventory item.quantity minus equal to the amount, because above we've already calculated the correct amount. And then if the inventory item.quantity gets less than or equal to 0, we just want to set inventory item.preset to null. And then of course we need to set back, as always, set back the inventory items array at the index back to the inventory item. There we go. Right, so now we can call remove item from here. And this will just be removed from the index by the amount, because we already set the amount here. All right, cool. So now we can successfully drop items as well. And I think this is pretty much all that we need here. We'll get into a little bit more in depth later. But let's just keep on going for now. Now let's jump back into the player inventory, which we already have here. I just realized, I think one thing I forgot to do was I forgot to initialize the inventory view, right? I think I did. Right, yeah, so now this initializes correctly as well, which means it has the inventory. That's of course important. And now in the player inventory as well, we now want to override what happens when we interact. Right, so let's just, for now, let's just do a debug.log, not logger.log, interacted with index, add index. Cool. And actually one of the things that we can do really quickly, we can just do if inventory items at the index dot preset is equal to null. Then we just want to return. And in this case, we can actually log out what we interacted with. Interacted with to dot preset dot item dot item name. Yeah, actually that's a good use case for it. Cool. So now we're logging out what item that we are actually interacting with. But we of course still need to make the actual interaction. And now how does this happen is we have to go further, one step deeper into the inventory view, because that's where the actual interaction happens. Have I lost the inventory view? No, it's here. Now in the inventory view, I once again also want a public void interact. And here we need to know which index we interacted with. Then we can grab the, not the inventory tiles, we can grab the inventory dot, and we can call interact on that with the given index that we now interacted with. Cool. And actually, let's also just make the drop here. So let's make a public void. I'll just call this drop item at the index. And then we can just call the underscore item or inventory dot drop item. And we just drop it at the index and we just want to drop one. So now we can make both of these. And now going back into our inventory tile, which I have right here, we want to make the actual interaction. And now this is easy enough. We just use the event system from Unity. So I pointer down handler. This should essentially handle what happens when, you know, the button image or the mouse button goes down over the UI element. So this should pretty much handle what we need for us. And you can see once again, it actually wants to autofill correctly. So it essentially checks the event data button, checks if this is the mouse button of the left and the right. If it's the mouse button of right, we want to drop the item. If it's the mouse button of left, we want to interact. So very cool. Let's go and test this. Let me also just spawn a bunch more wood, just so we have some more to play around with. So going into the wood here, spawn that, spawn that, spawn that, spawn that. There we go. And let me hit play. And now in here, as I click, I add them. You can see when I left click, now it'll say interacted with wood. If I left click on anything else, it doesn't happen, only when I click the wood. And if I now right click, we should now drop the item somewhere random. Cool. And I just realized I forgot to save it with the box colliders. There we go. Now it should work properly. You can see I can pick up all four, can drop all four, pick up all four, drop all four. Yeah, and as easy as that. So now we actually have an inventory system that works. Now we need to move on to the actual shared inventory functionality. Cool. So for that, let me first of all go into my canvas and let me just make a new inventory here. Let me duplicate this one, move it all the way over to the right instead. Let me lock this one to the right side of the screen. And then this one will be the shared one. So I'll just go here. I'll also change the title. This will be shared inventory. There we go. And here we go. Okay, so cool. So now we have the inventory view again, and I'm going to rename this one to shared inventory. All right, cool. Now let's go into our scripts, and similar to how we made a player inventory, I now also want to make a shared inventory, not a folder. And cool. Okay, first of all, this inventory actually can just have a direct reference to its inventory view, because this one can just be in the scene. This is obviously a shared inventory, so I can just put it on the canvas. In my case, you would of course put it on whatever chest or whatever that you have. Now in my case, let me also in unspawned, let me call the inventory view.init with this. And let me also do inventory items.unchanged. on inventory changed, like so. And let's also make sure to unsubscribe this on despawned, like so. And let's fill this out. And obviously what we want to do here is we want the inventory view dot redraw everything with the inventory items dot toArray. Now, also, let's try and figure out what actually happens when we go back and forth with our inventory. So first of all, since this is shared inventory, this is one of the places again where I'm just going to take a lazy approach. I don't think you should do this because obviously your instance won't necessarily be just a single instance. I think you need to find your chest, however makes sense for you to find your chest, since it's going to be in world space or whatever. But in my case, I'm just going to do it like so. I'm just going to register the instance, and obviously on destroyed, I'll have to, on destroy, like so. I'll have to do the instant handler on unregistered instance again to the shared inventory. All right, cool. Now, one of the things that we want to do here is we want to override the interact, what happens when we interact. Now let's remove the base of the interaction here. And what I want to do is I want to get the player inventory. Remember how we set it up as an instance? Let me just wait a minute with this. I guess we can keep it around. You remember in the beginning or earlier when we set up the player inventory? Also, I think this somehow did override my previous code. It did. The player inventory is only registered as an instance if we are the owner. That is why I can now do this. I can now just say try get instance, because I will always get my local inventory when I click. And obviously I don't want to move it from my inventory to someone else's inventory. I want to move it from mine to mine. Right? So that's what I'm doing in this case. So I'm getting my local inventory. I'm making sure that the item I clicked on is not null. And then what I do is to my local inventory, I try and add the item. And then actually here, I should probably do an if statement to check if we have added the item. And if we have added the item, then I remove the item over here, just to make sure. This is exactly why we made it a triad item, because in case that we can't add it to our local inventory, let's say our local inventory is full, we obviously don't want to remove the item from the shared inventory. Cool. Now we need to do this the other way as well. So in the player inventory, when we do interact with it, what I want to do is I want to do instance handler.try get instance out shared inventory. Again, this is not what you would necessarily do. You would do it with whatever inventory that you clicked on. But in my case, I only have one shared inventory, so I'm just going to make an instance and make my life easy. If we don't get it, we just return. You get the idea. We'll log some error here. Fail to get shared inventory. Whatever. Right. And then we'll do the same thing here. So if shared inventory.try add item, we'll do the inventory items at the index.reset, and we'll just add one. And if that succeeds, then we'll do remove item from me locally, which will be at the index, and we'll remove one. Cool. Okay, so now we actually should be able to move between shared inventory and our own inventory. It should actually be that simple to some extent, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So this is the inventory view with the shared inventory, and I'll also add the shared inventory script to it. I'll drag and drop the inventory view down here, and now let's try and test this out. So I'll pick up a few stuff, I'll click here, and as you can see now it gets added to my shared inventory. Now they're all over there. And if I right click, you can see right now I dropped them. I don't want to be able to drop from the shared inventory, for example, so let's just fix that really quickly. So going into my shared inventory, I'll take the drop method, or maybe we did not yet make that. No, it is virtual drop item. Okay, so let me do drop item here. There we go. And I'll just remove the base. This essentially just means now drop does nothing, which is exactly what we want. So now opening it up again, I'll pick all these up, I'll move them over to my shared inventory, I'll right click and nothing now happens. And if I click over here, I'll move it back to my inventory and I can drop it from my inventory. Cool. So here we have a pretty good inventory system where I can move stuff around exactly as I want it. However, let's try and test this in multiplayer and you'll see things might not be as good as we hoped. So now let me start over here and let me start on the client. Right, so here I have the client. So we know it already works on the server. And let me just move, for example, to 2 over here to the shared inventory. And as you can see, that works on the client, which is great. But now let me try and take it from the shared inventory, and all of a sudden we have issues, right? And these issues come because the shared inventory needs some kind of authorization. Somebody needs to control it, and obviously that should be the server. First of all, let me disable owner auth here, because I don't want the shared inventory to be owner auth for true. And we still want to make sure we set up the length of 12, of course. And now this is where code also once again becomes a little bit advanced. It's not very advanced and it's nothing to be afraid of, but it does become a little more tricky here. And the reason for this is because now we need to use some of PurrNet's very specialized code actually. And this is some of the things that you can't do with other networking systems, at least not this way. You'd have to work around it, right? So going up here to the triad item, let's actually make this return so first of all, let's make it a virtual because we want to be able to override it, how it works, because we want the triad item to be fully normal and local on the local inventory, but we want it to be networked on the shared inventory, right? And one of the ways we can do this is by making it into an async task. This is part of the returnables, and for this we need the system threading tasks up here. And essentially you don't have to change any other code. This is pretty much what you have to change. However, in here where we now do this, we have to await it, which means we need to make this an async and we have to await this. And same in the player clicker, we need to make this update into an async and we need to await it. There we go. Await essentially just means wait till we've gotten a response. Now in this case of how we set it up in the inventory script, like it is here, it will be instant. You'll get the response immediately because none of these are awaitable. However, in the case of networking, the response won't be immediate because obviously you'll have latency, you'll have ping, you'll have to wait for the server's response essentially. And that's exactly what we need it for. So going into the shared inventory now, let me also just make this into an async. Let me await this. And also now we want to override the triad, right? So let's do a triad item here and let's make this into an async override and we'll await the base. And then more importantly, we'll make this into a server RPC with require ownership of false, which now means whenever anybody calls this, it will be called and running on the server. And note that we're also sending the item preset, once again, utilizing the strength of the custom serialization that we made. So cool, this now means that players can add to it. However, this actually doesn't mean that players can remove from it yet. So let's also just make that functionality. So one of the things we need for this is if we go into the inventory again, let's go back into the inventory here. You remember we made the remove item into a virtual. Now let me go back into the shared inventory. And here we just need to override the remove item, like so. And once again, we need to do the same thing. We need to make this into a server RPC with require ownership of false. All right, cool. Let's go and test it now and see exactly how it works. And I'm gonna hit play over here. So yeah, I have my clone. So I pick up stuff. I have 3 of them. I can now add them to the shared inventory and I can now take them from the shared inventory. Cool. So now we actually have a fully functioning networked multiplayer system that the client can also control. Client, they can share items, they can all drop items, and it just works really well. Perfect. Well, I'm very excited about this system. I hope you like it as well. Now, let me just show you really quickly before, in case you just want to sort of get a very quick recap. One of the things that matters the most is essentially just when you set up items, you set them up with these item prefabs in the resources folder, and that's all. It should be easy from there to maintain. And it should be easy to use the system exactly how did you want to use it. So let me know what you think. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts of it. I think this is a very clean implementation. Obviously, this took a little bit of time to get set up. But now that it is set up, it should be really easy to use, should be easy to work with, should be easy to network, since you can just send the item preset around with the new custom serialization. So remember to leave a like, comment and subscribe. And other than that, I just hope that you have a wonderful day.